Hello, and welcome to the Extraneous and Miscellaneous podcast, if you can even call it that. Um, so, the whole idea behind this is just to get together and share my thoughts on things that I find interesting, which is quite a bit. Just got back from walking my dog, and so I have thoughts and I'd like to share them. Not necessarily on walking my dog because that's not too interesting, and I don't believe many people would like to hear the gross details of what may or may not have happened, what may have allegedly happened. So I may cover things relevant to current events, things relevant to my career field, or we may have people on time to time just to share stories. And that's something that I would really like to delve into. So if there are people out there, people that are connected to me or not, that would just like to get in touch and talk about their background or even just life stories, that's something I'd be very interested in doing. I believe life is really an opportunity to create stories. Um, we see this all the time in Hollywood, people creating these fictional stories, but some of the most interesting ones happen in our everyday lives. And all these experiences that we go through in life are an opportunity to create these stories. And there are a lot of people out there that have done things that you or I may not be able to imagine. So I'd like to really get in here and get this started. But before we do, I have a word from our sponsor of today's podcast, NordVPN. No, I'm kidding. I do love VPNs and I do love security in general for the cyberspace. So that's something that we may touch on either throughout today's episode or in a future one if I do end up pursuing this. So today I would really like to talk about what's going on in current events in uh, Europe, specifically Ukraine. And it's something that a lot of people are focused on. And there was an issue going in about how accurate our information was. A lot of people didn't anticipate this full-scale assault of Ukraine. And it's particularly troubling because it wasn't just a land grab. It wasn't a minor incursion like perhaps Crimea was, if you remember back to 2014. And so that would have been Barack Obama's second term when Joe Biden was vice president. Now we have the same man back in office for round two, and it seems like they're going to head further into Ukraine and see all of what they can conquest. So it seems like we were just behind, not necessarily behind the eight ball, but we were just way behind on where we should have been in securing the sovereignty of Ukraine. A lot of the sanctions that the White House has recently pushed out, and a lot of people's opinions, including mine, have not gone far enough. Biden himself said that we're going to see how these sanctions affect Russia, and we'll talk in a month. So that's concerning because a lot of the Ukrainian people don't have a month. That's a long time to hold out against such a big country like Russia. Now, there are a lot of misconceptions about Russia that I would like to clear up and point out. Russia isn't a giant evil empire on the likes to be compared to the United States or even China. Russia's GDP is smaller than the state of Texas. We have several times the GDP of Russia. We have a lot more economic assets than they do. And again, their country is wrought with corruption and ruled by a lot of oligarchs. So the number one way that I think that we should push back is to hurt them economically. War is a terrible thing. It brings a lot of bloodshed and a lot of heartache. There are a lot of tragic stories already of men having to give their children away, sometimes even to strangers, just to get them to safety, perhaps on the outside of the country. And for those with kids or for those with people near them, that would be very hard to do, to let your family go ahead of you, perhaps to safety, while you have to stay behind and fight for what may or may not be left of your country. And it's a really tragic situation. So Russia, as John McCain once put it, is a mob-run gas station, which John McCain and I may have not seen eye to eye on everything, probably because he's a little bit shorter than I am. So he really wouldn't have seen eye to eye on anything because, well, especially if we were just standing flat-footed and had, perhaps bare feet, I would have just seen right over his head. He wasn't a very tall man. So I don't think we saw eye to eye on anything. But he was correct on this. Russia is a mob-run gas station. Their main export is energy. It comes in the form of oil and natural gas. They also have control of a vast number of natural resources. So that is going to keep them in this fight. Now, even with our sanctions, and we've sanctioned their biggest gas producer, the largest gas company in Russia, that's not good enough because Germany and a lot of other countries throughout Europe are connected to these Russian pipelines and are importing energy in vast numbers. Not only are our European friends and allies doing this, but the United States is as well. We had, I believe, John Blinken came out. Let me background check this. Came out and said that we aren't going to stop our imports of Ukrainian energy. Yes, Anthony Blinken, United States Secretary of State, Anthony John Blinken. He said that we weren't going to stop our purchasing of Russian oil. Now, part of that is so that we don't hurt our own economy. Russia controlling this vast supply of oil and them being involved in this conflict has already seen a sharp increase in oil prices. We're already hurting in that field with our supply chain issues and remnants of the COVID economy healing. Gas prices were already surging. We did release a small supply from our oil reserves, but obviously that's minimal effect. Joe Biden is now permitted a second release from the oil reserves, but the amount being released, historically large as it is still only a fraction of a day's worth of production. So if you think back to 2020, we were heading into an energy independent direction. America had achieved energy independence. That's something that's very important, and once again may play a very important role in this whole conflict in Ukraine and with Russia. So energy independence isn't a xenophobic effort. It isn't to hurt other countries. It's to enable our own prosperity. And especially in times like this, we're not going to be reliant on that Russian energy. So the best way forward, I believe, other than sanctions, will be to ramp up our own production of energy. We once again need to be energy independent. And why this isn't already a thing is beyond me. We had cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline. Biden administration also stepped in and limited exploratory drilling. And they've imposed so many restrictions on this energy sector that were once again responsible for importing this foreign oil. Now, a part of the U.S., Mexico, Canada trade agreement that Trump had in place, the eventual goal of it was to establish a North American version of OPEC. Now, OPEC is a gathering of many countries over throughout Europe, the Middle East, that control a massive supply of oil. Now, whatever OPEC wants to do really dictates the price of fuel, gas, and these energy commodities. So if we can accelerate our own production, it will limit their power over what we do. Also, Germany has failed in the energy sector tremendously. Germany, they are a proud people, very proud, probably proud to a fault. They have great industry, great production, and they really have the say in what goes down in Europe. But right now, they're importing Russian energy in insane amounts to make up for their own failings. Now, Germany tried to go green, and I love that initiative, and I believe that's the future. but we are not ready to get off of the fossil fuels. That has to be a very controlled transition, and they failed drastically. So Germany tried to transition to solar and wind. And what happened there is when they have shortcomings from their renewable energy, they have to fire up their coal burning generators to even meet their energy shortfalls. And in the long run, it's produced more emissions than they would have had they've just stayed with their traditional path. And I just find that insane that we are financing Vladimir Putin and his cronies in this war effort, and we're doing nothing about it. We're putting these meaningless sanctions into effect when we really need to hurt them where it counts. Russia is an economy that's fueled off of, well, fuel and energy. And a lot of the people in power are there because of their money. That's where we need to be hurting them. We don't necessarily want to hurt the people of Russia or anyone throughout Europe, even our own American people. So we need to do what's right. And accelerating our own energy production within the United States will really help our own economy, the economies of Canada and Mexico, and we can hopefully weaken Putin's infrastructure and his own pocketbook. That's the only way he's going to back down. One of the very few things that speaks to people like this is money. So we need to attack them economically, not through meaningless sanctions or these gestures, but through something viable and something that will also help our own economy. I know several people that were laid off once the Keystone XL expansion was canceled. A lot of these people were contractors, so they didn't get this backup job or this failsafe. They were just told to pack it up and go home. So that was very hurtful. That was one of the first few things that was taken care of with the Biden administration. There are all these other initiatives that are much more important, but it seems like as soon as he came into power, the first thing was to cripple us economically. We come in promising jobs and growth, and what do? We axe one of our most important industries, which is our energy industry. We're going to see a lot of this once China does whatever it's going to do with Taiwan and our semiconductor industry. Taiwan produces something like 90% of the world's semiconductor supply that goes in anything like remote controls for our televisions, vehicles, gaming, computers, phones. Anything that really requires a circuit board is probably going to rely on these semiconductors. So not only will we be fighting on the energy front, we'll be fighting on the semiconductor front. There's already been an initiative, though, put through Congress to hopefully establish some stateside manufacturing, which is fantastic. But again, I think we're too little too late. We'll see. Only time can tell there. Now, aside from producing energy, I think another fantastic thing we could do is bolstering our electric car industry. And it's something that Joe Biden likes to talk a lot about, but he doesn't do it in the best way. So obviously, if you follow at all the automobile industry or just cars in general, you'll know that Tesla is the #1 electric car vehicle manufacturer. And Tesla has something that General Motors doesn't, Toyota, or any of these other companies that they don't have. Their cars are produced within the United States. This isn't like it's an American company contracting out and having their cars produced in Mexico and then shipped in. I know Toyota, they may be a foreign company, but they do a good job of doing a lot of manufacturing within the United States. A lot of my friends in Huntsville can testify to this because they work for Toyota. And I think that's a fantastic thing. So what I would propose is having rebates or perhaps some kind of tax credit for these people that are buying electric vehicles that are manufactured within the United States. I don't want this to be a global electric thing. I don't want people going out and buying BMWs, because Germany, they had a lot to do with this issue that's going on in Ukraine right now. They signed on and got in bed with the Russians with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which Biden signed off on, by the way, after he axed our Keystone Pipeline XL expansion. So it was never about the environment. Who knows? If we're not going to go into that too much, I just think that bolstering the electric vehicle market would be very smart, because once again, it would be less people relying on the gas pumps. So it would be another way. It's, if we're not manufacturing our own energy, we have to hurt their pocketbooks somehow. So getting these cars to be manufactured within the United States and then purchased and put into the rotation would be fantastic. Now, there are a lot of people with mixed opinions on Tesla and electric vehicles, but there are some things I would like to talk about. These vehicles are reliable, they are dependable. Now, Tesla doesn't have a great track record of quality assurance, but they are a company that is tens of times smaller than Toyota or General Motors. So they're doing the best they can with the resources they have, but because they're so far ahead in terms of technology, that's what's given them a large portion of this market. Tesla is an American company. It's not a foreign company. A lot of people had issues with buying a Prius or buying some of these other vehicles because maybe performance, style, or that they are foreign-made vehicles. But Tesla, they are primarily made within the United States. They have their factories in California. They have their factory in Texas, the Gigafactory. And so we are supporting American jobs and our own American citizens by buying American. And a lot of times people don't want to do this because the prices don't match up with what you might be able to buy from, as a Chinese product. They do turn out a lot of products that are made pretty cheap and they may do the job. But with Tesla, you're getting a vehicle that has some of the best value in the market. If you go back and try to buy a 10-year-old Tesla, you're still going to be paying just below MSRP because they maintain their value so well. They also require less maintenance, which is fantastic. And if you care at all about the planet, again, it's a good option. Now, not everything's great. We have lithium, these batteries, these things have to be mined. The recycling process is challenging. And so it's we're not quite the market hasn't quite matured yet. Now, once General Motors makes this transition, it looks like they're trying to in the near future, we may see more advancements there because overall competition is best for innovation. Without competition, you don't get innovation. You get you get a stalling of innovation. So that's why we need as much creation as we can here right now. Now, going back to energy, the United States needs to stop buying oil from Russia. The reason why this is so important is because we can't expect these countries over in Europe to cut off Putin if we're not willing to do it ourselves. Now, we can't be hypocrites in everything we do. And it seems like we are. We're sending away our own border patrol agents to go help with this Ukraine crisis. So we value their border security, but not ours, which is, very interesting. And it's also an interesting way to skirt sending in troops to Ukraine. So it was interesting. Whoever thought that plan up definitely did some outside the box thinking, some pretty unorthodox thinking. There have been several terrible videos that we've seen out of Ukraine. We've seen civilian houses and apartments bombed, missile strikes. At first, it seems like that Russia may go for military targets first. And it seems like Russia didn't think this all the way through. They didn't think that the Ukrainian people would resist quite so hard. Or perhaps they overestimated their own power and strength. Because now we've seen these terrible videos of civilians having to take up arms, families being separated. There was one I saw today of a tank swerving to run over a civilian vehicle. Luckily, the driver survived, but these aren't peacekeepers. The Russian people are being lied to. They have a large propaganda arm through RT. They have some good international coverage, but again, anything state-controlled is bound to have some form of bias and propaganda. We've heard stories which may or may not be true. There's a lot that may not be confirmed, but we've heard stories of platoons or Russian soldiers refusing to fight or just outright surrendering to Ukrainian forces because they weren't told the kind of bloodshed and the kind of conflict they were going into. And good on these people, whether it was just saving their own skins or whether they were honestly surrendering. I'm glad that we were able to avoid more bloodshed, because that's the last thing we want. A couple of the heartening stories that we've heard, many of them coming from the leader of Ukraine itself, President Zelensky. That man has a lot of fortitude. I'll put it that way. He has stayed behind with his people. Our State Department reached out and offered him safe passage from Ukraine because he is the #1 target. Russia's already stated they want to decapitate Ukraine's government and install their own puppet government. They're very open about what they want to do, and they're very open about their ambitions. But Zelensky had stayed behind a fight with his people. He hasn't run. That's something I don't think a lot of our politicians would do. And this man, if you don't know President Zelensky's background, he's primarily an actor and a comedian. So for someone of that background to come in and to lead with this much strength, this much force, is truly something that's inspiring and has inspired these Ukrainian citizens. They've given out something like 18,000 automatic rifles, these Kalashnikovs, to help repel the Russian forces. Perhaps if Russia does have their way and they do take the capital of Kiev, they'll have to switch to an insurgency form of fighting. And as we found out in the Middle East, insurgents are very hard to fight off. We found that same issue in Korea and in Vietnam. Once citizens take up arms, you don't know who to trust or where to look. And it's not like there's an ethnic barrier separating Ukraine and Russia. These are largely people that may have family within both countries. So it's a very trying time. I believe it was the mayor of Liev had he had everyone stay indoors. I'm struggling to think of the word, because it's going to be hard to tell who's on the road. Are they rogue Russian soldiers? Are they units scouting ahead, or are they your own citizens? So for their own safety, there's been a curfew put into effect in Liev. I saw a story on LinkedIn of this man who he works here in the United States for one of our tech firms. He's a recruiter that I've connected with, and his own family is in Ukraine. His parents are there and his grandfather's there, about to turn 80. He was scheduled to go back in April to visit his grandfather in Easter, hopefully see him again. Now, I believe there have been shots fired, and there have been bombings and explosions just within the outskirts of Liev, which is in a very, very western portion of Ukraine. Right past that border are NATO countries. So Russia has to be very careful about what they do, because they don't want to draw NATO into this. Now, speaking about NATO is a force comprised of many countries, and probably more effective than the United Nations, which still includes Russia for whatever reason. I thought it was called the United Nations, not the United Nations and then one that's trying to start a fight with the rest, but I digress. But NATO forces are projecting strength, and we do need to support our NATO allies. We were behind in Ukraine. We were very behind, and now we're unprepared for what's coming and then what's ongoing there currently. So we do need to support these people. We have Poland to worry about. We have Romania. We have the Baltic states. Finland and Sweden aren't a part of NATO, but perhaps they need to consider this. They have been threatened by Putin directly. Putin doesn't seem like his cold, calm, calculating self. He's been projecting these threats directly to NATO, to the United States. He's been hinting at nuclear intervention if NATO or the United States decides to intervene. And that's something that only a tyrant or a madman would do. We've kind of had this mutual agreement not to destroy the world, but Putin's threatening nuclear intervention if we decide to stand up for these people's freedoms. That's very bizarre. And it's far from the Putin we usually see. Very stoic, very calm, very calculated. This is a man who grew up within the Soviet Union and served in the KGB itself. He had a large part to do with the upstaging of, I believe it was Gorbachev in 91. I cannot remember. Bringing these facts up, perhaps I should research that as well. But he has wormed his way through and strong-armed a lot of people into giving him power. He held power for several years, gave it up, became the, I believe, prime minister, and then back to being president. Now he's in for what seems like he wants it to be his lifetime. And that's a hallmark of a dictator. It's something that we don't want to encourage. We've seen terrible things throughout Ukraine, but we've seen those very, very heroic actions by the people of Ukraine. One of my favorite would be the heroes of Snake Island. And if you've heard of that, they were guards on a border island outside of Ukraine, or inside Ukraine, I guess you could say. And they were threatened by bombing from a Russian warship. And when told to lay down their arms and surrender, well, they told the Russian warship to go away in very direct terms. Now, if you know what I'm talking about, you know the words they used, and I'm not going to repeat that. But they decided to stand their ground, and all 13 men were later killed in the bombardment of the island. There was also a bridge in Ukraine that the Russians were going to use to further their advance. And there wasn't time to remotely detonate this bridge. So one Ukrainian soldier decided to take things in his own hands. He told his unit goodbye. I'm going to do this myself. So he ran out to the bridge and directly detonated these mines to help prevent the advance of Russian troops. So very heroic actions. We heard about a Ukrainian grandmother, an elderly woman, who told Russian soldiers to carry seeds in their pockets. So when they're dead, laying in fields, they'll grow flowers around them. Now, again, there may be translation errors there, but again, very tough. These are strong-willed people. Now, I am meandering a little bit, but that's how this podcast is going to go. That's why it's extraneous and miscellaneous. I may loop back to points earlier. I may or may not. Now, another thing to focus on, aside from kinetic warfare in the Ukraine conflict, would be cyber warfare. Now, for years, we've dealt with incursions from Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran in the form of cyber warfare. The hard thing with cyber warfare is it's hard to kind of place it on a measurement. When does it become an act of war? And it's hard to tell whether these groups are state-sponsored or whether they're private actors. So it's a very difficult place to be. And Russia, as we know, they're very involved in the field of cyber warfare. At what point do we consider their actions acts of war against us or other NATO member states? If you remember the Colonial Pipeline, it was hacked by a Russian-backed group. And that did cripple supply. And so that's, I believe that was in 2021, so last year. And it kind of seemed like a preemptive strike, or kind of a telltale sign of what may be to come here with Ukraine. Now, the surprising thing with Ukraine is the power, the lights, the internet is mostly still on throughout Ukraine. Now, today, Russia did strike oil fields and oil refineries in Ukraine to try to kind of cripple that process. But largely, life in Ukraine is still going on, which has been really interesting, because it's something that we would have considered that would have been knocked out immediately. We don't want social media posts getting out, raising sympathy for the plight of these Ukrainian people. So you would think that Russia would take that out first, but that hasn't happened. So what's the strategy behind that? Has Russia overextended itself? Now, again, I tell you that Russia has a smaller GDP than the state of Texas. So it's really, they're a fly, they're a gnat on the wall. It's something that we shouldn't have to deal with. Our main focus now, aside from Ukraine, needs to be back on Taiwan. China may use this to learn lessons on what they may want to do when they push into Taiwan. China has made commodity deals with Russia to support them to buy coal and other energy resources to help shore up any losses that Russia may have from these sanctions that we put in place. So China and Russia right now are aligned in kind of an axis of evil. But Russia does have a history of turning on its dancing partners. So my hope is that if we put enough pressure on Russia, that they'll either oust Putin, or perhaps we can get his slimy hands pointed in the right direction. Perhaps we can turn and work together to fight our true enemy, our greatest enemy, which is Xi Jinping and the Communist Party in China. It's a very nuanced situation. It's terrible. There are a lot of people throughout Europe. There are a lot of military veterans in the United States that are taking up arms and moving in the direction of Ukraine to help out. And that's fantastic. But there are very many other ways that we can help. There's the Ukrainian Red Cross, I believe UNICEF, and there are many other charities that will help out the Ukrainian military directly. And I know there are a lot of charitable people out there, especially throughout the South. There's something that you may not know, but the southern states do have the highest charitable giving per capita in the United States. It's not somewhere in Silicon Valley. It's not in Hollywood. It's not where these people make millions of dollars. It's in the South, which is largely a poor area. Poor people know what it's like to go without. And so they give when they can. And this is a time where there are people out there that need our help. So if that's something that you feel compelled to do, I would definitely look into it, especially with the Ukrainian Red Cross, as that probably would be the best and most reliable way to help out the people over there. There are charities set up in Poland for these refugees that are coming in. So definitely look at helping out with these refugee camps. There are orphanages within Ukraine that rely on the government for half of their support. So if that's something that you need to look into or want to look into and feel compelled to give to, that would be a great cause, because if the government does turn over, half of these orphanages funding is going to go away. So I believe that's a very honorable cause. But I believe we're going to wrap that up. We kind of meandered all over the place. Didn't really cover much. But in the future, I want to have more of an outline of what I want to talk about, and hopefully stay on topic a little more. But this crisis in Ukraine is troubling to my heart and to my consciousness. And I want to raise visibility to it. And if anyone would like to come on and talk or have a conversation, then contact me directly. It's something I'd be very interested in doing. And maybe we'll continue this conversation on another day. But thank you for joining and listening to my ramblings, the ramblings of a madman. And hopefully our world can come together in peace. So if we can come together in prayer, I believe that's another great action. And God above is truly the one person that we can take comfort in, because we know he's watching over all of this.